let me tell you a little bit about my gardening experience. I have gardened since I was young. My parents put me in charge of the garden, which was a rock hard patch of ground to the side of our home that nobody really cared for. Put me in charge of the garden early on because I actually wanted to do it. And so before too long, as a teenager, I started choosing all the seeds for my family and would get the big burpee catalog when it would come in the mail and would pour through there and pick what we wanted to order for our family. And I would try to keep things alive, but I didn't have a lot of resources and didn't have any education, didn't know what I was doing. I would learn a little bit from my grandma. She was a great gardener, and she did a lot of things really well. I've since learned that there are other things that we can add that would even augment what I learned from her. And so a lot of what I'm going to share with you are things that I've learned through doing it. I love to read books, and I learn a lot through books, but most often I just learn by just going and actually doing it. And that's what I encourage you to do. As you're learning these things, you can learn them, and learning is an absolute essential part. It's that sharpening the axe that I talked about yesterday, but you actually have to use the axe and practice it before you get to a situation where you may need it. So I'm going to talk to you about some practical applications that you can use for winter gardening, no matter where you live, and gardening all year round. Let's just say that gardening all year round, not just winter, during the winter time. But winter time is a time when specifically we think, okay, how are we going to garden? How are we going to grow food? How are we going to have fresh food, even during the middle of very, very cold times? And there are ways. There are actually a lot of ways. So I want to share that with you. It's interesting. In the early 1800s, a lot of the big cities, pre that, most people were living in homes that had some sort of a growing area in the back. They were living where they had a yard that they could grow in, or they had fields that they were just situated right next to, or the community had fields and areas that they could grow in. But when the Industrial Revolution started in Europe primarily, what happened is that people moved to the cities, and they started living in these huge tenements that did not have any sort of growing area outside of them. They had no sort of yard at all. And a lot of the green spaces in these cities completely disappeared. It was taken over by housing, but it was also killed off by pollution. There was terrible pollution during these industrial times, where everything was coal powered and nothing was filtered. And there were times where they never saw sun, and not because it was cloudy, but just because of the pollution. So growing really stopped for the people that were living inside of these large cities. So when you talk about Paris and London and even New York City and some of these cities during this industrial time, people were flocking to the city, and they still needed food, but they didn't have any way to grow that anymore. Whereas generations prior to that always had a place to grow things. So really, they had to figure out how to do this. And they had big farms outside of these enormous cities that they would grow things all winter long and then cart them into the city during the middle of the winter time. Of course, they were doing this all year long, all summer long, all spring long, every season. But particularly during the winter, they were still doing it. And we forget about that because we live in a time and a place where we can get any food any time of the year at the drop of a hat. I can go to my grocery store right now and I can find pineapple, I can find papaya, I can find mangoes, I can find tomatoes, I can find cucumbers. I'm not growing any of that in my backyard right now, but I can go find it in the grocery store. So we forget that when the grocery store is not available, none of that is going to be available because none of those things are growing in my yard. So it's interesting as my family has really navigated and converted to what we call local eating. So we try to eat just what we grow. It's been kind of funny to see that transition. So around August, I was asked to bring a salad to something. And I said, okay, well, in August, the only salad that I have in my yard is going to be kale or it's going to be cabbage. And my kids looked at me and they're like, well, what do you mean? And I said, guys, have you noticed we haven't had a salad with lettuce since, late May, early June. That's when the lettuce all bolted. And they looked at each other and they went, oh, yeah, I guess you're right. Yeah, there is no such thing as a lettuce salad unless it's during springtime in my house. or fall, because I regrow the fall and actually winter. I'm going to show you why we're having salads right now. But we forget that because we have grocery stores. We forget that food grows seasonally and food grows in certain locations. And there's some things that we just simply can't grow. So we learn how to do without them, and we learn how to use what we have when we get it. So the key to growing during cold weather seasons is to harvest vegetables in the winter. There's something called the winter solstice. It happens around December 21st every year. And what that is the shortest day of the year. We're getting close to that, right? We're starting to get ramped up to that shortest day of the year time. And as you notice, the daylight hours are really getting short. We're having less daylight in the morning. We're having less daylight in the evening. And what that means is that there's a lot less light for seeds to sprout. So seeds are not going to sprout very well right now. So when you plant, if you're thinking, I'm going to plant a winter garden, you don't plant it in November. You plant it in September or October, because you need to have enough light to actually let those seeds sprout. So winter harvesting is really winter growing is really harvesting in the winter. You need to grow things that like cold. I have never grown tomatoes in the middle of the winter, or cucumbers, or summer squash, or beans, or any of those things that love heat. It's just silly to think about trying to grow them during the winter. And really what it is it's consuming a lot more energy than you really should put into it. Because I could grow a tomato if I really tried hard enough, if I had a heated greenhouse all year long, if I had grow lights that it was growing under, I could do that. But during an emergency situation, I would be very foolish to use all of that energy and all that fuel into growing a tomato in the middle of in November, because tomatoes would grow naturally without any of that fuel in August and September. So we grow things when they're meant to grow. And like I said, the seeds won't sprout before the winter solstice of December 21st. So winter garden is really about harvesting. So there's 3 things that you must do to be able to grow year round, to be able to grow into the cold season as well. You have to prepare the soil after you remove the summer crops. The way that the soil works, I love talking about soil, and I could talk about soil for years. I got to make sure I'm checking my time here. I could talk about soil for hours, because soil is like a community. And inside of that soil, you have fungal networks. Now, I want to talk a little bit about a tree. When you see the tree, you can see how tall the tree grows, and the limbs that go out, the leaves have fallen now, but you can see the architecture of the tree. There is as much tree underneath the earth as there is above the earth. Now, it's not going to be that thick trunk and all of the limbs like you see, but there is just as much below the earth in these little fungal networks that extend out from the roots of the tree. So the sunlight is taken up by the leaves of the tree, and through photosynthesis, it brings nutrients down to the roots. Now, at the roots, excuse me, the fungal networks are all in connection with the roots. So the tree brings nutrients from the sun through photosynthesis down to these fungal networks. Then the fungal networks, to repay that debt to the tree, they spread so far from the tree and find nutrients in the soil that the tree needs to be able to grow. And they bring those nutrients back and feed it back to the roots. So these fungal networks in the tree is very much in symbiosis. They're working together to help take care of each other. Well, when we are wanting to grow something, whether it be a tree or a cucumber plant, we have to treat that soil as a community, and we have to recognize that there's a lot going on beneath that soil that we don't want to disrupt. So if you're tilling or turning over your soil, what you're doing is you're disrupting all of those fungal networks, and you're asking them to have to rebuild those networks every single time you till. So what should happen at the end of the season, or at the beginning of a season? Well, actually it needs to happen at the end of a season, is you've depleted the nutrients in that soil. Those fungal networks have worked long and hard to bring all the nutrients that they can possibly find everywhere in that soil to the plants that are growing. But you've really depleted that at that point. So you have to refeed the soil nutrients so those fungal networks can feed it to your plants next year. So you have to feed the soil. You have to feed it organic matter. Right now, leaves are the very best source of organic matter you could possibly give your soil. So put the leaves on the soil. You can add straw, you can add hay, you can add all of your kitchen scraps, which you can add directly to the soil if you want, or into a compost pile. You can add manure from chickens, from cows, from horses, from any animal. You have to be a little careful about weed seeds and things, but honestly, even those feed the soil. So you need to feed the soil this time of year. Now, what do you do in the spring? Do you go and till it all up? No, because that soil during the winter time, during this time, it's sleeping some, but it's allowing those nutrients to percolate down into the soil and help build those fungal networks. If you go and just disrupt it all and till it all up and stir it all up, they're going to have to start again in the spring. You don't want to lose that ground. You want it to be really ripe with nutrition by the time you put your seed into it. Then for winter growing, you want to plant early enough in the year for the plants to be established. So even if go back to one for just a second, even if you're not planting a winter garden, you need to do number one, no matter what. Every single garden, you need to do number one. The number two, you need to plant early enough. So for a winter garden, it should have been planted already. Now you can still put, like Esther said, you can still put garlic into the ground. You can still do some things, and you can plant in some other ways. I'm going to show you that in just a second. But really, the plants need to be established before these short daylight hour days start coming. Then you need to plan where you've planted to allow for covering when it's really cold. So what that means, I'm going to show you here in just a second. I made a mistake this year. I planted collard greens in my beds that I like to cover in the winter. Those collard greens could have stayed there all winter long, but I had to take them out to be able to put the cover on. So it was a mistake. I didn't plan very well. So plan where you're going to plant. Excuse me, so that you can cover them if needed. All right. Options for winter protection. Everybody thinks to be able to grow during the winter, I have to have a greenhouse. This isn't true. I'm going to show you a whole bunch of different options that have nothing to do with the greenhouse. The very last one on the list is a greenhouse. And I used to in a previous home, but currently I don't have a traditional greenhouse. When I say traditional greenhouse, what I mean is the hard plastic or polycarbonate covering, and it's hard on the outside and I could heat it. I don't have that currently. And I grow things enough to feed our family all winter long. I'm going to show you how I do that without a greenhouse. So there's a few things just to introduce you to the ideas of. So fleece is a lightweight covering. It looks like interfacing. If anyone's ever done any sewing, it looks like a fabric, kind of a mesh type fabric. And that fleece is very lightweight. It raises the temperature of whatever is underneath it about 7 to 9 degrees. So if you are going to be growing in a place that's not going to get to freezing, it's just going to get cool, fleece would be wonderful for you to cover your crops with, because it's going to give it about a 5 to 7 degree increase in temperature. Or let's say it's going to get down to, maybe the high 30s. Well, this is going to keep it well above freezing if you add this to it. Now, in an area like I am in, where it's going to freeze and we're going to get well below freezing, fleece isn't going to be enough on its own. So you can do a couple of other things in addition to the fleece. You could put fleece on and then also cover it with what we call any of the next three things on this list: cold frame, a hot box, or a low tunnel. But let me go through each of those individually. What a cold frame is, and I'm going to show it to you in just a second. What a cold frame is a grow box. So something built intentionally as a box with soil inside that you've covered with the polycarbonate. So that's the material that they do use on the outside of greenhouses. You've covered it in polycarbonate. The polycarbonate serves to warm the soil inside of that box as well as the air. So it's going to be more than 5 to 7 degree temperature increase, and you're going to be able to grow things all winter long, even in a freezing area. I grow things in cold frame all winter long, and they will freeze solid at night, and they will be back to growing during the middle of the day. The key to that is growing cold loving things inside of those cold frames. I do not have tomatoes and cucumbers inside of those cold frames. I'm growing lettuce. I'm growing bok choy, spinach, a lot of greens, because they do fine. They can freeze solid at night, and they're back to growing during the day in a box like this that warms up. A hotbed, a little different thing, and it's a little bit harder for us. They use this a ton in Paris and London and all these big cities, because at the time the transportation was by horse. So they had a lot of extra manure all over the place in the cities. So they would cart the manure back out to the big farms outside of the cities, and they would build these hot boxes. The way you build a hot box is you actually have to dig down 3 feet of soil. So inside of your box, you're going to dig 3 feet of soil out. The first 2 feet you're going to put back is going to be hot manure. So what hot manure means is manure that's fresh, because all the manure, once it's fresh, it has a high level of nitrogen, and it literally will burn your plants if used in that hot form. But you want it hot for this. You're going to put 2 feet of manure and then a foot of soil on top of the manure. So it's going to buffer your plants from the hot manure, but it's going to allow that manure underneath to give heat. And you can actually grow things. They would grow things like cantaloupe in these hot boxes in the middle of the winter outside of Paris and London. So hot box is something I've never done. I don't have a plentiful supply of manure right now, but perhaps in an emergency, I'd be able to go find some. A low tunnel. A low tunnel is a 2 to 3 foot high plastic covering over an existing garden bed. These are things that can be used often in mini gardens. Again, I'm going to show you in just a second how we cover ours, but you can put the plastic covering so you can start plants in a garden in August and September. I think I even planted some of mine in early October. Get the plant started and growing before it freezes, then cover over with this plastic. And again, if it's a cold loving plant like a green or turnip or a parsnip or a radish, something like that, what you're going to be able to do is continue growing that underneath this plastic layer. A high tunnel is what I do have and what I call my greenhouse. That's a big, tall, plastic covered greenhouse. It's not hard on the outside. It's plastic covered. It works great for what I call season extension. So what that means is I'm going to plant in there in January. Now they're not going to sprout great until we're starting to get longer days, which would be mid-January, early February, but then things are going to take off and I'm going to have a whole greenhouse full of salad by about 1st of March, which is great because in my normal garden beds, I'm not going to have a whole, garden full of salad until probably end of April, 1st of May. So it'll be able to extend my season. I can push my salad growing season up about a month or half using my high tunnel. But the problem is with the 6 to 8 feet, that's a lot of air that has to be warmed. So it actually doesn't work very good during these coldest months. It works better if I were to put fleece or other greenhouse plastic over the beds in the greenhouse. Then I'll be able to get something to really grow. So I have things planted in mine right now, but they're not doing much. They're little teeny tiny starts. They're not doing much right now. They will take off about mid-January, early February. So those are the different ways to grow. I'm going to show you them, what they look like here in just a second. The greenhouse, one thing about that, the hard-sided, most expensive kind of greenhouse, it does not increase the yields in the winter, meaning you're not going to get more growing in that in the winter because of the low light. We really are constrained by the amount of light we have during the day, the number of hours we have of light during the day. So there's just not a lot of growing happening. You want to be, by these low light days, you want to be getting to the harvesting point. So I'm so hopeful that this is going to work this time. Let's try. I tried to get everybody in my house off the internet. So let's see if it's going to work. Hi, I'm Dr. Michelle Jorgensen with Living Well with Dr. Michelle, and I want to give you a snapshot of what we do for winter gardening around our home. The first thing you can see here are what we call cold frames. These are raised beds, but they're a little different. The north side of the box is a little higher than the south side of the box, and what that does is create an angle. We then put a plexiglass covering on top of this that's removable. We lock these down. That plexiglass covering makes a greenhouse effect. So the air and the dirt underneath there stays warm, and we're able to grow all year round. Now the cool thing is we don't have to water these because if it's a nice day like today, condensation will actually drop down on the plants below and we don't have to water. So right now I have spinach growing, lettuce, a whole bunch of Asian greens. Okay, so I'm hearing that you can't hear very well. So I'm just going to have to, back to it though. I will just tell you what I said. All right, so let's talk through these couple things here. Cold frames are the things that you can see in the very forefront of the video. What these are garden boxes that I have that have a higher end on the south side and a lower end on the north side. And then I've covered them with the polycarbonate sheets. You can just get these polycarbonate sheets at Home Depot, and we anchored these pieces of wood on the top so that you can actually lift them a little easier. What this does is it angles that polycarbonate sheet forward. So it makes it so the south side is getting more sun, and it creates a little mini greenhouse. You can see they're quite low to the ground. They're not very high off the ground. And the reason is less air to warm. So I'm going to grow things in here that aren't going to get very high. So the what I have in here, you can just see kind of looking at this picture, I have spinach growing in the front bed that's closest to the bottom of the screen. In the back bed, it's all Asian greens. I have a stir fry mix in there, some bok choy, a whole bunch of different things growing inside of that one. In the right side that you can't see a lot of green in, it's lettuce that's just coming, and we'll see how big it gets before we get into these really low light times. The one in the very front, that's the one I just pulled the collard greens out of. That's why it's not covered yet. Behind that, you can see the low tunnel. So what that is it's a garden bed, an existing garden bed that I have that I've covered with plastic. Now I could use that plastic on any garden bed. It doesn't have to be a grow box like what you see. It could be any of my garden beds that you see behind me. I can also cover, but you need to have something that's a support to hold the plastic over top of you need to have something that holds the plastic excuse me, above the plants. Somebody's just asking which is higher. You want it higher on the north end because you want the south end to be lower and the polycarbonate to be sloped toward the south, because that's where your sun is going to come in the wintertime. Sorry, just answer a quick question. So low tunnel here, what we've done is we have a rebar that we've stuck in the ground at an angle at the corner of each of the boxes. You could do this, like I said, on any garden bed. I used to do it just over my garden beds. We have a rebar stuck in the ground that's narrow enough diameter that I can slide. What this is conduit piping. It's used for electrical conduit. I can slide the conduit piping over top of the rebar, and it just slides all the way down to the ground. And then I bend that rebar, or I bend that conduit piping up and over, and there's another rebar at the other corner end of this box that it slides onto. So I've measured how much I needed to give about 1.5 feet clearance here in the center above the tops of the plants. Then the plastic goes over top of these supports. This one here in the end is actually electrical conduit that we've used as well. That can be pushed right into the ground itself. It doesn't even need the rebar. And you can get a conduit bender that you will actually bend the corners of. And so that's what we have on the end. We had used that in a greenhouse before. We have a couple of different options out here in our beds for covering, but all of these things are just to keep the plastic off of the ground. Then you can see I just have some paving stones out here on the side holding the edges down. The reason I have that on the edging is because I want to be able to get to these crops inside of here. Inside of my low tunnel right now, I have spinach, lettuce, radishes, parsnips, turnips, a bunch more Asian greens, some frisee, something called corn salad or mache. If you could just look up greens that are winter hardy, you will be able to find lots of things that are going to be able to grow fine during the middle of the winter. It's crazy. So those are some covered things. And then you can see my high tunnel in the back. Like I said, I don't have a lot growing in there right now because I'm going to plant in January. The reason I don't plant a ton in there, actually, this is good to say, is because I don't water in there. I am on secondary water. And so I don't like to haul my hose out there and water in the middle of the winter because I have to unhaul it and, drag it through the snow and whatever. So I don't like to water. You absolutely could water in there. You just have to be very careful about your water that it's not going to freeze getting out to the greenhouse. So I don't water. The cold frame and the low tunnel, I don't water at all. The condensation on the bottom of the plastic and the polycarbonate waters these boxes and all of the beds for me. So I very rarely water them unless it's getting really dry and it's been really hot. Then maybe I'll peel it back and add a little bit of water and then just put the covers back on because again, it'll condense. So I don't water these. When I want to start watering in February, I will plant out in my high tunnel and those will grow quite quickly because it'll be quite a bit warmer than the air outside. So those are the covered options that we have. There's a few things though that I pointed out in the video, and I'll send this video later, that you might not see that aren't covered. So right here by my feet is a bed of Swiss chard. Swiss chard, collard greens, kale, a lot of these real hardy greens, they will grow again if you leave them in your ground. In fact, right behind me, I actually have a Napa cabbage or a Chinese cabbage that I've just left out there. I'm going to see if it'll come back in the spring. So all of these things often will come back, even after a hard freeze, even after a hard winter, they will come back. The second year, a lot of those are what we call biennials, which means the second year they will set seed. And during that second year, you can harvest seed from them. So this Swiss chard right by my feet, I harvested seed from all summer long. There was so much seed, and a lot of it just fell as I was harvesting. So I'm guessing I'm going to have about 10 billion Swiss chard plants here next year because of all the seed that fell. So there's reason to keep things in the soil that will continue growing. This is kale back here that you can see. Most of that will probably survive and will come back next year. So leave things that you can continue harvesting. I can keep picking the Swiss chard even now, and I've had many, many hard freezes. Over here, I have some garlic in a bed. Garlic, you don't have to cover. You can mulch it, so I can put a whole bunch of leaves or straw or something over that and mulch it, but I found I don't have to. It will just grow back next year. It'll just start sprouting in the spring. Somebody asked if I am in American Fork. I'm in Pleasant Grove, so right next to American Fork. So we get hard freezes here. So the garlic can go in the ground now, and it's just fine. So really what I wanted to show you in this video, and I could do it through explaining this way, is there's a lot growing in this yard, even if it looks like nothing's growing in this yard. I mean, you can see a few little spots of green here and there, but you'll be surprised at how much there is growing and how much there is that we are harvesting out of these beds all year long. Now, I won't tell a lie. I mean, I'll tell you that sometimes in the middle of the winter, the last thing I want to do is go out and move these stones off of the plastic and pull it back because it's wet and it's dirty and it's cold. And, so sometimes I'm thinking, I think I'm just going to go to the grocery store. But you know what? If there were not a grocery store, I absolutely could and would go out and eat out of my beds in the middle of the winter time. And I would be so happy to have these foods for variety, for all the reasons I told you in the cooking section, for variety, for enzymes, to help digest all those foods. And doesn't it just make you happy, honestly, to eat fresh food? It just kind of lifts your spirits a bit, especially if you've been subsisting on beans and rice. So there's a lot of opportunity to grow right here, even in the middle of the winter. So some common things that you can grow in the winter: lettuce and cold hardy greens. Those are big ones. Carrots, what you do with carrots, somebody just asked, do I leave the root crops? So I have done it both ways. I typically lose some both ways. So for carrots, I could leave them in the ground. And what you do if you leave them in the ground is you mulch them heavily. So I had a huge bed full of carrots. And in the past, I have just layered on a bunch of straw. And then when I want to harvest in the winter, I go and I peel back the straw and then I harvest the carrot. The problem that I found with that is that there are actually, I think they're called root maggots or root fleas or root something that get into the carrots when they're left in the soil. And I will typically lose about a third. Somebody just said the real name, I think, with it. Freeze carrot flies. Yeah, I will typically lose about a third of my crop to those. So if I'm okay with that, that's fine. I typically lose about a third of the crop the way that I did it this year too. What I did is I did harvest all of my carrots, and then I put them in layers with damp sand and put them in my root cellar. So, but I typically lose about a third of that as well. So either way, I'm going to lose it, but I had the manpower to help me harvest all the carrots this fall. So that's why I did it that way. Broccoli can grow in the winter. Onions, spinach, Asian greens, radish, turnips, all of these can grow in the winter and do quite well actually in the winter with a little bit of covering. So it's amazing what you can grow. Other ways to provide your own food year round. So you can grow inside on a warm windowsill. You've often probably seen little potters with herbs and things growing on windowsills. You can grow lettuce easily inside on a windowsill. You can grow kale inside on a windowsill. You can grow radishes. A lot of these same cold-loving plants grow just fine inside on a windowsill or under a pot under lights. Again, that requires a lot of energy input, so I don't like to do it if we don't have to do it, but you can grow in a pot on a windowsill. You can raise perennial trees, shrubs, and vegetables in your yards. And, I do a whole day workshop on gardening and self-sufficiency and feeding yourself out of your yard. I love this picture because this is rhubarb in this picture. You would never know it. It looks like a beautiful landscape plant. Oftentimes you can have plants scattered throughout your entire landscape and no one knows that they're edible but you can use them for eating. So I have things all over through my yard. I have rhubarb, Jerusalem artichoke, which just looks like a really tall sunflower, asparagus, fruit trees, berry bushes, and berry bushes are what I've pretty much replaced all of my landscaping bushes with. So I have gooseberries and currants and justaberries and goji berries. And those are all of my landscaping plants, and they're growing food for me year round. Not year round because they don't live, but I just actually picked some goji berries off of my bush because I didn't get them all picked in the fall, and they're just fine. They've been frozen, but it's just kind of like my own little freeze dryer out there right now. So you can grow a lot of food in your yard. Store your crops in a root cellar. Now, what if you don't have a root cellar? We were married for 20 years before I had a root cellar. And the last home that we moved into that we live in now, that was one of my requirements when looking for a home, is we had to have the potential to put in a root cellar. And we have one now, but we went many, many years without one. So some of the things you can do for root cellaring are you can store in a cold window well. You can store inside the window well if it's an unheated basement or a cool basement. You can store outside in a window well. Use a straw bale and use it to insulate that window well and from the snow, but yet it will stay very, very cold. You could put a piece of plywood over top of that window well if you didn't mind losing the sun, and you could really turn it into your own little greenhouse or your own little root cellar down there. You can use a garbage can buried in the soil that you then mulch at the top of, that you can store all sorts of root crops in for the winter. There were things that you can look up where they would store these clutches of potatoes, and they would store them in a pile and then cover them in straw and all sorts of mulch type material, and it would keep them from freezing. Someone just put an old dead freezer, exactly, an old dead freezer laid on its back that you could then open the door from. If you mulch the top of and keep it from freezing, you can store all sorts of things inside of those. So there's all sorts of ways to store crops and then preserve food all summer long. I just had a neighbor bring me a box of apples just yesterday, actually, from his tree. He said he needed a family to adopt them. And my family is always the family that will adopt any stray produce that might come our way. And so we adopted a whole bunch of stray apples yesterday. And today, after this, I will be root cellaring the ones that are good. In fact, I'm going to go to that. I think that's what's next on here is, preservation. So Esther covered a lot of this, so I'm going to go just quickly through some of this. But there were so many societies that have been preserving their food for forever, long before we had refrigeration, long before we had electricity, long before we had all the ways that we do now. There are ways to do it, and it's really kind of fun to relearn some of these things. Fruits and vegetables, you can dry them in the sun. Right now, I have a barn. I have kind of an outbuilding that's full of peppers that are drying because it's hot. It gets hot in there during the day, and they're drying there because I had way too many to fit inside of my dehydrator this year. Grains can be stored easily if you store them in a cool, dark area. Meats, Esther talked about that some. There's a lot of curing and brining and smoking that was done because if we're looking at this indigenous Native American society, if they were to kill an animal, they either had to eat it all right then, or they had to figure out a way to preserve that meat to be able to use over an extended period of time. And there are lots of ways to do it. Dairy and eggs, again, we covered that already. Condiments, think about that also, preserving condiments. So make some salsa, make some ketchup, make things that actually make food taste good when you're preserving. But things like corn, as I'm just looking at this picture right here, corn, I always leave my corn on the stalks until it's dry, till the corn's dry and the stalks are dry. And then I harvest that corn and pull the corn off of the kernel, off of the cobs. It's very usable in that format. You have to soak it with lime water. It's a whole nother talk, but make sure you soak that correctly. But corn is a great one to store because it'll store indefinitely. Pumpkins, squash, Esther talked about that. I had enormous squash that stored for over a year last year in my basement, just a cool basement, and they work just fine. It provides food. So again, cold storage, make sure you're below the frost line. So if you're burying a garbage can, an old refrigerator, anything like that, make sure that you're below the frost line of the soil. Now, how do you find the frost line? You dig until you find it. You'll find it because it won't freeze past that line. And typically you'll see kind of a delineation in the soil itself. It'll be kind of, I don't even know how to describe it. Above the frost line will be almost alkaline looking. There's some white things in the soil. And then below that, you won't see freeze. You won't see frost crystals. You want to be below that freeze line or you need to insulate above the freeze line. Otherwise it will freeze. Like I said, drying, you can use the sun. Fermenting. I have done a lot of fermenting over the years, and we do a lot of fermenting. Excuse me. I do a lot of fermenting all year long because fermenting preserves those enzymes that I was talking about. You absolutely want to have enzymes when we're eating all of those hard beans and grains and things. Fermenting is a great way to add those enzymes, and very beneficial enzymes. As I was studying kombucha, I learned that kombucha is extremely useful for someone that has diarrhea. So again, an emergency, these are things that are going to be very useful. Practice now. Make your own yogurt now. That one's an easy one. Make your own natural yeast bread. That one's actually fairly easy as well. Culture your vegetables, sauerkraut, kimchi. Every single indigenous society has some sort of fermented vegetable or fruit or grain because that's how they preserve their food. Just practice. Try these things out. Canning. You can can over a fire. Esther talked about the rubber gasket. It's good to get canners that don't have plastic handles or rubber gaskets because they will melt in a fire. Curing, brining, smoking meat. There's so many different ways that you can preserve food. So not only can you continue growing food, but you can also preserve food for the times that you can't grow, or when time's a little lean from growing. So action plan for what the things that I really want you to do. I want you to grow something now. I don't care what it is. If you just get a tiny little pot and you put a couple of radish seeds in there and see if you can get them to grow in your windowsill, do it. They might not grow great right now because of our low daylight hours, but I just want you to try. Or start sprouting something. Get some of those beans that you have in your storage, cover them with water, let them soak overnight, then drain them, rinse them 2-3 times a day. They're going to start to sprout. I want you to grow something. I want you to see the power that you have already in your home to be able to grow something year round. Then I want you to plan for growing if you need to. I want you to look at your yard and think, okay, where are opportunities for growth right here in my yard? And don't wait until an emergency comes, because if you think you're going to just be able to take a big old patch of grass and turn it into a garden and have all the food you possibly need to survive in an emergency within a month's time after an emergency, you're sadly mistaken. That will not happen. You need to have fertilized soil. You need to have all of those good organic things, and that fungal network already have been being built. So if you have a flower bed, you know what? There's no better purpose for a flower bed than to grow some food. So start adding some nourishment to that flower bed. And next year, instead of planting just something that's ornamental, I want you to grow something that's ornamental and edible at the same time in that flower bed. Plan for what you're going to grow and how you're going to do it. Try preserving using one method. So just try something. Try drying something, or try an easy ferment like yogurt. Extremely easy ferment. You use the yogurt from a grocery store, one that actually has live active cultures in it, mixed with some milk. You warm it up, you mix it in, and in a couple of hours, you have your own yogurt. Just try your own. Try to see how you can do it. And what you're going to find is that when you do one thing, you're going to feel pretty cool and you're going to want to do another. And it always kind of grows on each other until you just can't stop learning and doing these things because you love them. And it gives you security because you know you're going to be able to feed your family. And then I want you to buy seeds for growing. So these are my action items for you. I really want you to hit these hard. I want you to make sure you're doing them. I want you to buy seeds for growing. Now, someone asked earlier, where you buy seeds. My favorite store, or my favorite seed catalog, is called Baker Creek Seed Company. I love Baker Creek seeds. Literally, they are my Christmas wish list catalog. And usually they send their catalog about the middle of December. And I just pour through that thing. The pictures are absolutely gorgeous. The plants are gorgeous. The seeds are gorgeous. And I want every single one of them. I have to restrain myself and not buy every single one of them every year, but buy some seeds for growing, and then save your seeds. You don't use all your seeds, so put them in a cold place and use them again next year. Buy new. I always buy new every year, but I always save the ones I have, because even if they won't be as good at germinating, meaning maybe only 50% of those grow, 50%, that's 50% more than nothing. So I always save any seed that I haven't used all of as well. So those are the action items that I really encourage you to do. I see we've had a lot of great comments on here about yes, rareseeds.com is Baker Creek. Thank you. About different ways to store. We'll pull all of these comments on here about how to do it. Can you still buy seeds right now or only in the spring? Good question. And thank you actually for asking that question, because guess what happened in March of last year? All the seed companies sold out of their seeds because everybody was worried about food because of COVID. Guess what? COVID's still here. People are still going to be worried about food. So what you need to do is you need to be checking on those seed catalog online sites. You need to be checking frequently, because they're going to have some things that are out of stock right now, but you can often put yourself on the waiting list so that when they come in stock, you're going to be able to get those back ordered items. I typically order all of my seeds end of December, 1st of January. If you don't, they're going to be sold out. It may be that I'm going to need to order even earlier. Now, right now, the seed catalogs, the seed companies are processing their seeds. So they may not have them available because they grow the seeds. They grow just like we grow plants. They grow seeds they grow plants that produce the seeds during the summertime. Then they process those seeds, getting ready to sell them starting in December, January, February, and on through the summer. So they may not all be available, but you can get on their lists for when they are available, because I think that this is going to be a hot commodity. If we talk about food shortages in the stores, we're going to find seed shortages everywhere. Get on a few seed catalog lists, a few others that I like. Some are actually owned by Monsanto nowadays, which I don't love, but you know what? Sometimes politics go to the side if it means me eating or not. So Territorial Seed Company is a great one. So is Johnny's Select Seeds. I believe both of those have now probably sold out, but they still provide good seeds. There's a few that are excellent, and you always want, this is a whole nother talk, and I'm on my last minute here, but you always want to buy an heirloom or what's called open pollinated seed, because those seeds are going to be able to be reused. They're going to, when those plants produce their own seeds, you're going to be able to use them for growing next year. That's the ultimate food storage, is in saving your own seed to be able to plant food next year, and then the next year, and then the next year, and the next year, and always having self-perpetuating seeds. So make sure you're only buying heirloom or open pollinated seeds, never hybrid seeds. So some of these companies will sell a lot of hybrid seeds. Do not buy them. Do not be tempted. You can grow plants next year, but you're not going to be able to perpetuate those plants in years to come. So make sure that you're buying only heirloom or open pollinated seeds. All right. Now is the best time. Ken says now is the best time to buy seed, because it will be from this year. They can still legally package before November. They can still package and sell seeds from last year. So it's going to be new stuff from now on. Yep. So now buy it now. All right. Thank you. Hopefully that is a really quick, again, firehouse talk on winter growing, winter gardening, but also preserving so you have food year round.